This is episode 3, Dialogue with the Dead, two Western views of tradition. And links to the two views discussed in this video can be found in the description below. In the first episode, I looked at Heidegger and his characterization of the Weltanschauung governing our modern world, what some have called global capitalism, the grid, the world of reduction to profit, efficiency, and material being. Heidegger saw tradition as a potentially opposing force to this. And he says that he tried to make his university a place for reflection upon the tradition of Western European thought in opposition to the, quote, merely technical organization of the university, which is kind of the organization of the university we know now. And I quoted Heidegger in his Spiegel interview saying that, quote, everything essential and of great magnitude has arisen only out of the fact that man had a home and was rooted in a tradition. So in this episode, I want to think for a moment about what that tradition is. And I'm going to look at two distinct views of tradition, one coming from the Odyssey of Homer and one coming from a personal letter of Nicolomachiavelli to a friend. I think these two views work well together to give us a strong picture of what tradition can mean. And I want to begin with the fact that there has been a break with the past, and our knowledge of the Western tradition is fragmentary. Not because we only have little bits of it, not because the tradition is fragmented, but because we are fragmented. We don't have a view of the whole, a worldview, to use a modern phrase, from which we could see the tradition as a whole rather than as separate parts or fragments. The tradition is always there, but the lens through which we're allowed to view it or through which we can view it, that's shattered. And so the closest thing that we have to a unified view of tradition is a revolutionary lens. And that revolutionary worldview or lens, it sees tradition as something to be overcome. It views the past as bad because the revolutionary places his hopes in the future. We're building a better world. When I was coming up through college, it was popular or common to dismiss the tradition because it was the work of dead white males. The tradition or the past was something to be deconstructed or analyzed for its errors or looked at for what were the implications for gender, race, and class. In other words, what benefit it had to us as modern revolutionaries. So it was mined for any value it might have for a revolution. It was dismissed or deconstructed, or at very best, it was seen as just waypoints on the way to the present. Right? How did we get to where we are? We came through these staging points. But the tradition as such was not seen as something from which one could really learn anything. Now, that wasn't 100% of the view of everybody, but it was so pervasive a view, so dominant a view, that it kind of dominated everything else. And it has dominated everything else for many decades now, at least since the 1960s, when the last vestiges of a prior regime were essentially swept away. So how do we regain a unified view of the whole? Let's start by going back. At the end of Book 10 of Homer's Odyssey, the hero Odysseus learned that in order to go home, he and his crew had to descend to the underworld and speak with the shade of the seer Tiresias. He tells his crew this, and as you can imagine, they're quite unhappy with the prospect of traveling to the land of the dead, but they follow him down and they bring sacrificial animals as instructed. And in Book 11, their encounter with the dead is described. Odysseus says, "When I had prayed sufficiently to the dead, I cut the throats of the two sheep and let the blood run into the trench, whereon the ghosts came trooping up from Erebus. They came from every quarter and flitted round the trench with a strange kind of screaming sound that made me turn pale with fear. When I saw them coming, I told the men to be quick and flay the carcasses of the 2 dead sheep and make burnt offerings of them, and at the same time to repeat prayers to Hades and to Proserpine. That's the god of the underworld and his bride. But I sat where I was with my sword drawn and would not let the poor feckless ghosts come near the blood till Tiresias should have answered my questions. So he keeps them away, and first, the ghost of one of their crewmen comes to them. They ask, "How did you get down here before we did?" And he explains that he was sleeping on the roof and he was too drunk. And so instead of taking the ladder down in the morning, he fell off the roof and broke his neck. And he asks them to, when they return up to the world above, that they bury him properly. Odysseus promises to do that, but they don't let him drink of the blood. Odysseus even sees his own mother and he wants to talk to her, but he needs information first. So they wait until, and they drive off or keep the ghosts away until finally Tiresias comes. Then came also the ghost of Theban Tiresias with his golden scepter in his hand. He knew me and said, "Ulysses, noble son of Laertes, why, poor man, have you left the light of day and come down to visit the dead in this sad place? Stand back from the trench and withdraw your sword, that I may drink of the blood and answer your questions truly." So Odysseus does this, and then later Tiresias explains, "Any ghost that you let taste of the blood will talk with you like a reasonable being, but if you do not let them have any blood, they will go away again." I'm not the first person to notice that this episode can be a wonderful metaphor for communicating with the past, for communicating with great thinkers and artists and writers of the past. We too are on a journey like Odysseus, and we need information to help us return home. And the dead may have information for us. But to learn from them requires sacrifice. The dead do not simply give up their information willingly. You must give something to receive. And giving blood to animate the spirits, to focus the spirits, is a great image, in my opinion, for that experience. And in a way, it's what I'm trying to do in these videos. I'm sort of like Tiresias, trying to explain to you how you, as Odysseus, can speak with the dead. I'm trying to show ways in which you can animate these thinkers and bring them to life and speak with them, and what you may need to do, what you may need to bring to the table to make that happen. Another writer who describes this experience, who makes explicit the metaphor, is the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And he describes it this way: "I too have been in the underworld, even as Odysseus, and I shall often be there again. Not sheep alone have I sacrificed, that I might be able to converse with a few dead souls, but not even my own blood have I spared. There were 4 pairs who responded to me in my sacrifice: Epicurus and Montaigne, Goethe and Spinoza, Plato and Rousseau, Pascal and Schopenhauer. With them I have come to terms. When I have long wandered alone, I will let them prove me right or wrong. To them will I listen if they prove each other right or wrong. In all that I say, conclude, or think out for myself and others, I fasten my eyes on those 8 and see their eyes fastened on mine. May the living forgive me if I look upon them at times as shadows. Those 8, on the other hand, seem to me so living that I feel as if even now, after their death, they could never become weary of life." That's from Human All Too Human, the second part, and it's Aphorism 408. So Nietzsche makes explicit the metaphor that I described above. To be part of a tradition is something interactive. It is a kind of living. It's a kind of life, a special kind that you carry within you. It takes sacrifice, perhaps even personal sacrifice, as in Nietzsche's case, he says that not even my own blood have I spared. So I think his explicit example shows how easily that Homeric image can be applied to the summoning up of figures from the Western tradition. Now let's look at our second example, which is taken from a letter written by Nicolomachiavelli to his friend Francesco Vettori, who was the Florentine ambassador to Rome. The letter is from December 10, 1513. The Papal States are an important political actor in European affairs, so the ambassador there would be an important person. So the date of this letter, Machiavelli has been removed from his political position in Florence. The Medici family has been restored. He was suspected of conspiring against them, and he'd been tortured. He was tortured with a rope, which means that he was hung up by his arms, hung up by his hands. His arms held his whole body weight, dislocating his shoulders. He apparently was tortured over a period of about 3 weeks. They suspected of him conspiring against the Medici. He didn't confess to anything, so they released him, but because he was held in suspicion, he was not restored to his political office, and he basically had to retire to his paternal estate, which was a small bit of land outside of Florence. He wasn't exactly reduced to penury, but he was far from what he was when he was a major player directing Florentine affairs. And he talks about various things that he gets up to now that he is living in exile. And he writes thus to his friend. So he describes some of the things he does, and then he writes this. When I have finished eating, I return to the inn, where there usually are the innkeeper, a butcher, a miller, and a couple of kiln workers. I slum around with them for the rest of the day, playing crica and backgammon. These games lead to thousands of squabbles and endless abuses and vituperations. More often than not, we are wrangling over a penny. Be that as it may, people can hear us yelling in San Casciano. To put this in perspective, imagine someone who was a major figure in the U.S. State Department, and then the government fell, and he was replaced, and he wrote to a friend who was still an important ambassador and still talking to all kinds of important people, and he says, yeah, these days I'm hanging out with Jiffy Lube employees and Walmart stockers and arguing with them over penny ante poker losses. I mean, it's almost an absurdly comical fall there. And that's what Machiavelli is essentially describing to his friend. And then he goes on to write, when evening comes, I return home and enter my study. On the threshold, I take off my workday clothes, covered with mud and dirt, and put on the garments of court and palace. Fitted out appropriately, I step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where, solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine, and for which I was born, where I am unashamed to converse with them, and to question them about the motives for their actions, and they, out of their human kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours at a time, I feel no boredom, I forget all my troubles, I do not dread poverty, and I am not afraid of death. I absorb myself into them completely. So this is the other side of the encounter with tradition. Like Nietzsche, Machiavelli also sees it as a conversation with the great thinkers of the past, an interaction, an opportunity for learning. But what Machiavelli shows is that in addition to requiring sacrifice, the blood that nourished the dead in the Homeric example, the tradition can also be the food. Machiavelli actually calls it the food that alone is mine and for which I was born. So this experience can also be a respite, a place apart from the everyday working world, the world of commerce and consumption in a purely literal or physical sense. Consumption in the sense more of what the soul consumes. And I think most people have this experience that he describes, at the very least with music. Even an ordinary person can have the experience of being absorbed completely in something by listening to music for hours on end. And Machiavelli is saying that he has that experience of forgetting his troubles, of being absorbed in something, forgetting even the fear of death by communicating in his mind, by communicating with the ancients. Let me put this in practical terms. You can try this, not with music, but with ideas. You can try this where If there's a great writer that you enjoy that you think might have some good images or good answers, let's say you enjoy Homer, you can read and enjoy that author, possibly listen to it read aloud, although in my case, it's hard for me to focus actually when I'm listening to it read aloud. It's easier when I'm reading it because I can, as I read, pause to think through a passage. It's harder to do that when you're listening to it read aloud. And for works like this, sometimes I think you need to pause them to think through something that you've read, because that's where the engagement happens, where you say, well, wait a minute, what would that actually mean? What would that mean in modern terms? Or what would that mean to me today? But find something from the tradition that you can engage with in this way, whether it's philosophy or history or poetry or even music, but find something that's part of the tradition. So not the Beatles, but Bach. Not that the Beatles are bad, but that there is more exercise to be had by trying to appreciate and come to terms with Bach. You have to sacrifice more to get there. But if you do that, if you make that sacrifice, you will be nourished in turn. And going forward, I'm hoping this channel can introduce you to writers or works that you might want to engage with yourself. So you too can enter into the courtyards of the ancients. And later in this year, 2022, I'm going to start to produce a series of videos which can be specific introductions or gateways to major works or major authors that can help people who want to engage with specific great works from the past. So these will be specific works like Don Quixote or Faust or Plato's Republic or Livy's History, things like that. And if you have any specific requests, you can add them in the comments and I'll be happy to consider them. So to engage with the past, to speak to the dead, requires sacrifice, but repays sacrifice. That's the key lesson of the fragments that we looked at today. Engagement is open and available, but it requires that we abandon the revolutionary view, which sees the past as something to be overcome, or something to be rejected, or something to be viewed with anxiety, like Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence. I think that's a revolutionary view, because I think when you consider Machiavelli, did he seem to show anxiety of influence in terms of the ancients? No. He seemed to assume that he was speaking with them as equals. I speak to them and ask their reasons, and they, out of their human kindness, reply to me. That's anxiety of influence is the feeling of a revolutionary who wants to supplant, who wants to do better, who wants to overcome. That's why you're anxious, because you realize the greatness of the past and you're not sure you can overcome it. But if you're not obsessed with an overcoming or a revolution, then you don't have that same feeling. And why is that important? Well, the two dominant strands of modern thought stem from Marxism or liberalism. And those are both revolutionary approaches. We inhabit a world in which revolutionary forces, whether fast or slow, those have created the world that we know today. They have forced the break with tradition, in the sense of the view or the lens through which we can view tradition has been so fragmented, so shattered, that we can't really see it for what it is anymore. But the world these forces have left to us it's not the paradise they promised, nor can we even foresee the paradise they promised. From my point of view, we can see only one version of dystopia after another, which says to me that the revolution has failed. It's leading to disaster. The time has come, therefore, to return to a pre-revolutionary view of tradition, to get guidance in a different direction. And I hope this video offered a good look at what a pre-revolutionary view of tradition might be. In the next episode, I'm going to take a look at, so I mentioned those political forces driving the modern world of Marxism and liberalism. In the next episode, I'll take a look at the fundamental political options and what those are, and hopefully that will help drive our understanding of what our politics is not only now, but what our politics can be moving forward. And I'll take a look at that in the next video. I hope to see you there.